On March 18, 1915, Mexican revolutionary Wenceslao Mogul faced a firing squad in Jalisco, Yucatan. He was shot multiple times and left for dead, but he miraculously survived. However, what happened next would leave you speechless. Here are the shocking stories of those who lived through their own executions. Number 10. Willie Francis. Willie Francis was a black teenager from Louisiana who made history for surviving the electric chair. In 1944, pharmacist Andrew Thomas was shot and killed. 9 months later, Willie was arrested as the main suspect. Police claimed he had Thomas's wallet, but no evidence was ever presented. The murder weapon was linked to a local deputy, but that fact was ignored. Willie was given 2 court-appointed lawyers who did nothing to defend him. No witnesses, no objections. The all-white jury convicted him in 2 days, and despite being a minor, he was sentenced to death. On May 3, 1946, he was strapped into the electric chair. The switch was flipped. He shook violently, but he didn't die. A corrections officer had set up the chair incorrectly. Another lawyer fought for an appeal, arguing the case was fishy, but the Supreme Court rejected it. A year later, Willie was executed, for real this time. A tragic case of justice denied. Number 9. Anne Green. Anne Green was a domestic servant in 17th century England. In 1650, she was accused of infanticide after suffering a miscarriage. The court found her guilty, and she was sentenced to death by hanging. Her execution took place at Oxford Castle. She was hanged for 30 minutes before being pronounced dead. Her body was then placed in a coffin and sent to Oxford University for dissection. But there was a problem. Anne wasn't actually dead. After nearly a full day without food, water, or air, a physician noticed movement. Checking closer, he found a pulse. Doctors quickly worked to revive her, administering treatment until she could speak and move. 3 days later, her judge died, and with no one left to challenge her case, she was officially pardoned. Despite some public outcry demanding a second execution, Anne was set free. She went on to marry, have children, and lived until 1659, proving that sometimes even death itself can be cheated. Number 8. John Smith. Some men cheat death once. John Smith did it over and over again. John Smith, born in 1661, was a London thief with a history of breaking into homes. Before his life of crime, he served in the Navy and later became a soldier. However, a series of bad decisions led him to a life of theft. In December 1705, Smith was caught and sentenced to death for his crimes. When he was hanged, something unusual happened. He survived. After hanging for 15 minutes without dying, he was taken down, revived, and sent to recover in a nearby house. Smith's luck seemed endless. Just months later, he was caught again for housebreaking, but avoided punishment due to his previous sentence. However, when he was arrested for a 3rd time, it seemed like his luck had run out. Yet, the prosecutor died before his trial, and Smith walked free once more. In 1727, Smith was finally caught again, this time for attempting to steal a padlock. He was sentenced to penal transportation in Virginia, and after that, his fate remains a mystery. What became of him after that, no one knows, but if history proved anything, Smith had a way of surviving. Number 7. John Lee. At 21, John Lee was convicted for the 1964 murder of his employer, Emma Keyes. Evidence against him was weak, but he was the only male present at the scene, and his past criminal record raised suspicions. Despite his claims of innocence, Lee was sentenced to death by hanging. On February 23, 1885, the first attempt at his execution failed. The trapdoor wouldn't open. The executioner tried again, but it failed again. He tried once more, and still nothing. The medical examiner embarrassingly called off the execution, and Lee was returned to his cell while the mechanism was tested. When the tests worked, the trapdoor still failed to open when Lee was placed in position. Finally, the judge commuted Lee's sentence to life in prison. Later, evidence came forward that Lee may have not been the only male in the house at the time of the murder. People called the incident a miracle. Number 6. Alan Eugene Miller was sentenced to death for killing 3 men, Lee Holbrooks, Christopher Yaney, and Terry Jarvis, during a delusional episode in 1999. Convicted of capital murder, he was set to die by lethal injection in Alabama on September 22, 2002. But the execution turned into a nightmare. The team struggled to find a vein, stabbing Miller's arms, hands, and feet over and over again. After 90 minutes of failed attempts, they resorted to blindly jabbing his flesh, hoping to hit a vein. Blood pooled beneath him as he sat helplessly, strapped to the gurney. When nothing worked, they tilted the gurney upright, his body bleeding from multiple punctures. Then, without warning, the execution was abandoned. Guards stitched his wounds and sent him back to his cell, alive. Now his lawyers are fighting for an alternative method, arguing he shouldn't endure another botched execution. Number 5. Joseph Samuel. Joseph Samuel was a German convict sentenced to penal transportation in England, but instead of living out his sentence, he escaped and committed a crime that led to his death sentence. After fleeing to England with other convicts, Samuel took part in robbing a wealthy woman's home. During the robbery, a police officer was killed. Though he admitted to the robbery, he denied the murder. The woman, however, identified him as the criminal. With no evidence against the others, Samuel was the only one sentenced to death. On September 26, 1803, he was hanged, but something strange happened. The rope snapped, dropping him to the ground. A second attempt failed when the noose loosened. A third try, with a fresh rope, failed again. The stunned crowd began shouting for mercy. Officials halted the execution, and the governor commuted his sentence. 3 failed hangings were seen as a sign. Fate had spared him. Number 4. Rummel Broom. Rummel Broom was a convicted rapist and murderer. Born in Michigan in 1956, he moved to Ohio as a child and later fell into a life of crime. His early offenses included carjackings and sexual assaults, but his most vicious crime was the 1984 abduction, rape, and murder of 14-year-old Trina Middleton. Broom was arrested after DNA evidence linked him to the crime. He was convicted and sentenced to death by lethal injection. His execution was scheduled for September 15, 2009, but when the time came, prison staff struggled to find a usable vein. For 2 hours, they struck him repeatedly, causing intense pain. At one point, Broom even helped them search for a vein himself. Eventually, the state called off the execution. His lawyers fought to stop a second attempt, arguing it would be cruel. For years, he remained on death row, even writing a book about his failed execution. The state rescheduled his execution for March 16, 2022, but death found him first. On December 20, 2020, Rummel Broom died from COVID-19 complications. A man sentenced to die by the state ultimately met his end on fate's own terms, cheating the needle, but not time. Number 3. William Duell. William Duell was a teenager when he was sentenced to death in 1970. He'd been found guilty of assisting in the rape of a woman named Sarah Griffin and was ordered to be hanged in Tyburn, England. On November 24th, Duell was executed alongside 4 others. His body was left dangling for 20 minutes before officials declared him dead. From there, he was taken to a medical theater for dissection, but as attendants prepared his body, something shocking happened. He started breathing. At first, the breaths were faint, but they soon grew stronger. Within hours, he was conscious and speaking. Doctors quickly reported the situation, and Duell was sent back to prison. The ordeal left him with no memory of the execution. Public support grew in his favor, and instead of being hanged again, his sentence was changed to exile. He was sent to North America and lived out his days in Boston. Number 2. Wenceslao Mogel. Wenceslao Mogel should have died that day. Wenceslao was a Mexican soldier born in 1896. He served under General Francisco Bonova, but was captured during the Mexican Revolution and sentenced to death by firing squad. Execution by gunfire is brutal, but Mogel endured something almost unbelievable. He was shot multiple times, 8 or 9 bullets ripping through his body. To finish him off, the squad delivered the final coup de grace, a close-range shot to the head. But Mogel wasn't dead. Stunned and bleeding, he stayed completely still, pretending to be lifeless. When his body was taken down, he waited for the right moment and crawled away, dragging himself through the streets in the dead of night. He made it to the Church of St. James Apostle, 3 blocks from the execution site. A church member found him, took him in, and helped him recover. Scarred and disfigured, Miguel survived, defying death itself. Number 1. Kenneth Smith. Kenneth Smith was a hired killer. In 1988, he was paid $1,000 to murder Elizabeth Sennett, the wife of a pastor, as part of a life insurance scheme set up by her own husband. She was beaten and stabbed to death in her home, but the plan fell apart and Smith was caught, convicted, and sentenced to death. After spending more than 30 years on death row Alabama set his execution date for November 17, 2022, but when the time came, everything went wrong. The execution team struggled to find a suitable vein, sticking him over and over again. They punctured his arms, hands, and even muscle tissue. Blood ran down his skin. At one point, guards tilted the gurney backwards, forcing his head down in a painful position. For nearly 4 hours, Smith suffered through the failed execution until officials finally called it off. But Alabama wasn't finished with him yet. On August 26, 2023, a new execution date was set, and this time, the state had a different plan. Smith would become the first person in history to be put to death by nitrogen hypoxia, a never-used-before method where pure nitrogen replaces oxygen, causing death by suffocation. Kenneth Smith had already escaped death once, but this time, there were no second chances. And those were 10 failed executions. What do you think of the failed executions? Do you think it's just chance, or is the hand of fate intervening? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe, like the channel, and turn on the notifications for more death-defying videos just like this.